Good morning, and thank you for giving me this opportunity to speak at this conference. It's a great honor and pleasure. When I realized I would have an opportunity to speak about culture and peace, I felt both excited and challenged. And I approached this as a cross-cultural psychologist, and so that's the frame that I will be bringing to this question. I think it's very informative to look at how other cultures talk about the notion of peace, because peace is different depending on the culture you come from, the language you speak, and your own personal, political, and social environment. How you define it and the kinds of actions that you support in the pursuit of peace will be determined by how you define peace. So this is the framework that I would like to take in discussing culture and peace today. Now, although I have said that definitions vary culture by culture, the United Nations has provided us with a definition when they proclaimed this decade to be the International Decade of Culture of Peace. And I'd like to read you their definition because I think it's quite informative and raises some important issues. According to the United Nations, the culture of peace is a set of values, attitudes, modes of behavior, and ways of life that reject violence and prevent conflicts by tackling their root causes to solve problems through dialogue and negotiation among individuals, groups, and nations. Now, the definition goes on at length after that, but I would like to focus on the first two aspects of that definition. They start by claiming that there are a set of values, attitudes, modes of behavior, and ways of life that are agreed upon across cultures. And this first assumption is one that I would like to discuss. Is it true? Do we have evidence that we all agree on which values and which behaviors and which attitudes lead to peace? And the second part is that they define peace as nonviolence. And that is one definition of peace. But it is a very narrow definition of peace. And so I would like to return to that point as well. But let me start with the question of, do we all understand that the same values, attitudes, and behavior lead to peace? We can ask this question in two ways. One is to simply say, is it true that we all support the notion of peace? And the answer is, yes, we do. But do we all support peace of the same kind? One way of asking this question is to look at cultures that have been identified as being nonviolent. I'm going to here use a very narrow definition of peace and just talk about nonviolence. The definition that the United Nations put forward was actually created based on their observations of cultures of war. And they looked at what characterized a culture of war, and they assumed that the opposite is a culture of peace. That may not be true. There has been research by Bruce Bonta that has looked at both sociological and anthropological studies of societies around the world. And he has collected these studies and identified approximately 42 societies that can be defined as peaceful, and the Jain Society is included in that 42. And here again, he is defining peace as nonviolence. And what we try to do is to look at the characteristics of those different societies, cultures, and see what their shared characteristics are. If we can see what they share, that will inform us about what is required in order to actually achieve nonviolence. What was surprising in his research was how little these cultures shared. Some of them were very egalitarian, some of them were very hierarchical, some of them were rural and isolated, others were integrated with society. Some of them practiced very strict child-rearing techniques, others are very lenient and warm and very patient with their children. The only thing that seemed to be shared across these different societies was the importance of nonviolence to their self-definition and their worldview. And this raises a very important point about the value of nonviolence, or the value of peace. Peace is a universal value, but we don't all consider it to be the most important value. So there are many cultures for which peace is important, but material success is more important, or power and control are more important, or pleasure is more important. So it's not sufficient to just say we value peace. One needs to actually value peace centrally and ahead of all our other values. And this is a challenge. Let me turn now to the different definitions of peace. The United Nations definition was nonviolence. This is what Richard Wagner calls a negative definition of peace. It is peace defined as the absence of war or the absence of conflict. This, again, a very narrow definition, one that is based on avoiding something negative rather than a pursuit of something positive. Richard Wagner proposes that we think about positive peace as well. Positive peace being the creation of something new, the creation of social justice, and an approach goal rather than an avoidance goal, so not driven by fear, but driven by positive emotions. Interestingly, where cultures seem to agree on peace is only in the negative definition. Most of the research that has been done in psychology that looks at how cultures think of peace has only been done with children. And most of this research has been done in North American and European societies. So it's a somewhat narrow view. But what they have found is that children understand the meaning of war quite early. By the age of 8, children can define war. They define it in terms of concrete actions and behaviors. They see it as an active state. At that age, many children do not know the meaning of peace. The definition of peace comes much later. It tends to vary not only between cultures, but also within cultures, so that even within a culture, children disagree on what peace actually means. And the one core that seems to exist across cultures is that peace is nonviolence, the opposite of war. Again, it is also defined in a very passive sense and in a very abstract sense. Based on this, the researchers have concluded that the problem in these societies is that there is a failure to educate about peace. We teach our children about war, we talk about war, but at least in the West, we do not talk about peace, and we do not really teach the meaning of peace to our children. And finally, and coincidentally, I am also going to turn to the concept of internal peace. When many societies talk about peace, the very word for peace includes elements of harmony, inner peace, or well-being. But this is not true universally. And one of the questions that has been raised is, do we need to pursue inner peace in order to achieve societal or political peace? And there have been some psychologists who have also addressed this question. Because they're psychologists, they had to give it a different term, so instead of calling it inner peace, they called it subjective well-being. But they looked at 51 nations and asked people to describe their feelings of well-being. And they also asked them about their attitudes towards a variety of characteristics that are related to more peaceful societies. For example, greater tolerance of minorities or of immigrants, greater confidence in parliament and in civil services. And what they discovered is that in these 51 nations, on average, people who report a greater sense of subjective well-being, which may be a form of inner peace, are more tolerant. They strongly endorse attitudes that are more strongly linked to peaceful societies. But an important point, in addition to the relationship between peaceful attitudes and subjective well-being, is that this relationship was not found in those countries that report very high levels of violence and very high levels of poverty. So that inner peace is not enough. One needs to also have the social conditions for peace. And we cannot just work on ourselves as individuals, we must also work on our social context. So just to summarize briefly, what does the psychology of research on peace tell us about peace? It tells us that peace can only be achieved in a society that values peace above all else, and that we have to challenge ourselves to really think about where in our priorities peace really lies. Secondly, that we need to put more effort in educating our children about peace, not just to avoid violence,